Good morning. Thank you for coming in on this dreary morning and welcome to STL History Live. Our presentation today is Minds United, the women's club movement in St. Louis. I'm Tammy Goldman, Director of Tourism and Visitor Experience, but today I'm your host, really the assistant to ensure the program runs smoothly. So as you know, due to the present situation, nearly all of our programming is virtual. Hopefully that will be changing in just a few weeks, but I did want to remind you the Missouri History Museum and Soldiers Memorial are open to visit Wednesday through Sunday from 10 to 5. Because your safety is our top priority, the capacity to the buildings are still restricted and do require advance reservations. All tickets are timed entry and are free, of course. To reserve in advance, just go to plan your visit at our website, mohistory.org. And very simple, you can take care of it again in advance or when you get to the museum, but it's much easier if you just sign up through our website. Before we begin, just want to do a special thank you to those in the audience that are members of MHS. Of course, we can't do what we do without you. Your support is so greatly appreciated. If you're not a member, I will put some information in the chat as the program is going on to show you how you can support us. And of course, we also want to send our appreciation to the Zoo Museum Tax District. We sincerely thank you for all the tax contributions from St. Louis City and County residents. So I want to quickly mention a few details about how the program will run. I'm sure you can all, I bet, recite these along with me, but this will be roughly about a 20 to 30 minute presentation, followed by a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session. But those of you that know Amanda know that she loves to answer questions throughout the program. So normally we would say, save all your questions and put them into the Q&A section towards the end and we'll answer them. But today is a little bit different. Today you can put your questions as soon as you think of them in the Q&A section, and Amanda will answer as best she can. But that doesn't mean that we won't still have time afterwards. Today, closed captioning is available through the presentation. If you would like to utilize this function, just click the arrow next to the box marked CC and you can have subtitles show up. If you don't want them, you can hide them. Want to mention this program is being recorded, so if you'd like to view it again or share with others, it will be posted on our YouTube channel for Missouri Historical Society. And lastly, but most importantly, your feedback is always very important to us. We would really appreciate it if you could just answer a few questions after the program is over. A Kobo Toolbox survey will pop up in another tab in your browser, so keep an eye out for that when you leave this session. So let's get to why we're here, and I promise I will be quiet. Today's program, again, is the Women's Club Movement in St. Louis. It's presented by our own Amanda Clark, who is the Community Tours Manager and, importantly, the developer of the CSTL Tour Program. So Amanda, the screen is yours, and take it away.
Thank you, Tammy. Let's see, the clicks. Okay, so hi, and welcome to everybody. I'm seeing some familiar names in the participant list that have made me really happy to see everybody here this morning, especially some familiar names. As Tammy said, when I'm not, I'm the community tours manager. So when I'm not doing fun talks like this one, I am usually off somewhere leading walking tours of St. Louis neighborhoods. And as of June and July, we'll be out there hopefully offering some bus tours as well. The CSTL program is entering its second year. Those are fun words to say. And we have a lot of new tours coming up. In addition to the ones we already offer, our newest tours are the Hill neighborhood, which is selling out pretty regularly, and also a new one of the Tower Grove South neighborhood that's coming up in May. And as she said, it's important to note my presentation preference. I'm happy to answer questions as we move along. I will regularly check the chat and check the Q&A before I kind of move on to new topics, and then I can answer the questions. And at the end, if we want to chat about some other stuff, that's great. I'll also put my email address in the chat at the end. so that if you think of something else, or if you want more materials on the topic, if you want me to suggest some directions you can research, um, I'll put my email in at the end that you can use. All right, so on to the women's club movement. I love talking about the origins of it because this is one of those topics that had me constantly saying, what? Like as I got deeper into it. And if anyone here is involved in any of the women's clubs now in St. Louis, or you have connections to any, I'd love it if you shared that in the chat, just so we can all know that there's still people out there that are connected, not just connected, but a lot of these clubs are still really active. And to study the topic of women organizing into clubs, you have to understand it was a thing, like capital THING, that kicks off kicks off after the Civil War and really gets going in the 1890s into the turn of the century. So my talk is going to focus on that time period. It's going to focus mainly on clubs at the end of the 19th century and a little bit into the early 20th century. There's definitely clubs before that time period and definitely clubs after, but that's when that major social shift is occurring in America that makes the whole thing explode in a good way. After I discuss the general movement, I'm going to discuss some of the specific clubs in St. Louis. And there were a huge number of them. So I can only do surface level for these clubs. And there were so many to choose from in choosing them. Some of these clubs had straightforward names like the Monday Club, the Tuesday Club, things like that. But then there were also clubs with names like the Query Club, the Clotho Club, the Fortnightly, the Literary Sketch Club, and the 20th Century Club. It's just a few of the names I had to choose from. The clubs that I have chosen to highlight all represent a different experience of the women's club movement. So I've tried to not just do the same kind of experience over and over, but 4 very different experiences and different groups of people. All right, and I just wanted to, it's been pointed out to me that you can only put questions in the Q&A, not the chat. So yeah, if you put your questions there, I'll be able to see them as we move along. Let's go. So if you want to put as a Q, you can put if you were involved in one of the clubs, and can share that with the group. So when I started researching this topic, one of the directions I always go to are newspaper records first. That's one of my first places I love to just start looking for crumbs that I can then head off and search up. And of course, my first keyword, just from my own knowledge and what I knew of the club movements, was the keyword club woman. And because I know that club man is a thing and club woman is often used as a description. And that's something that a lot of women, if they were involved in them, they were used, that was a word. So like if in their obituaries, for example, or a description of someone in the public realm, it would say she's a mother, a wife, and a club woman. Like that's how important it was. And before I could even start looking at the individual results of that keyword search, I was hit in the face with a statistic that told the story I was looking for. So when I put in keyword club woman from the 1870s, I got 1 hit back. From the 1880s, I got 4 hits. The 1890s, I got 1,032 responses. And from 1900 to 1910, I have 4,088 keyword responses. So that tells the story of the growth of the movement. There were certainly clubs of different types for women before the Civil War, but again, it's the social movement and the emergence of the new woman that, with capital N and W, it gives rise to women realizing the power of gathering. That's the important part of this. The new woman, again with capital N and W, refers to the shift at the end of the 19th century as women start to move towards less restrictive clothing, athletics, more educational opportunities, and just overall freedom. And the club movement is a big part of that. The first clubs start to happen in the 1860s and the 1870s in New York and Boston, with upper class women beginning to use the club as a way to assert their rights to exist outside of the domestic sphere. So they kick off a movement that convinces the general population of middle class American women of varying ethnicities and racial backgrounds to begin to undertake serious study of intellectual topics and current events, which then leads to organizing for social reforms, local, state, national level politics. All these things are in a line. women's clubs between 1870 and the 1920s become like the main way that American women can develop and exercise the talents they need to shape the world in mass outside their homes. And the 20th century, the world we live in, and now 21st century, offers an increasing amount of ways for women to be involved. But even today, women's clubs are in the thousands. They have international membership reaches. It's still very much a thing. And most of the clubs now focus primarily on social and civic issues, which includes about volunteer, it really encourages volunteer work. By 1890, the General Federation of Women's Clubs was founded as a central organization for all of the clubs. It's still a large organization with a big office in Washington, D.C. And by the early 1900s, their membership was around 800,000 women, and it continued to rise into the 1920s. Initially, instead of social things, the clubs started to exist as a way to develop women's minds and strengthen the community to learn about issues of the past and contemporary urban problems. And many of the early clubs were known as literary clubs, and they can be seen as the direct ancestor to the modern movement of the book club. And there is a lot of really good academic work on connecting the book club movement of today, and actually it's 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, the book club movement, and connects directly to these literary clubs that start in the mid 1800s as a way for women to come together around intellectual pursuits. Some of these early clubs focused on literature, history, geography was a big thing, women learning about the world, the bigger world outside of the US. Some of them focused on reform, like street lighting and the environment. Environmental activism can also find early examples in the women's club movement. And most of the clubs that moved towards social reform issues and volunteering focused on the lives of women and children. So it's kind of the ways that they were set up. The club movement was not just for big cities. They began to form in every sized community. All areas of the country had some form of the club movement emerge in their communities. But of course, like a lot of really cool things, those 800,000 women in the Federation in the early turn of the century, they can be traced back to one lady speaking up. That is Jane Crawley. So Jane Crawley is right here. She is considered to be the founder of the women's club movement. She also wrote its first history, so maybe she decided that she founded it, but still. She's considered the founder. She lived in New York, and in 1868, she wanted to attend a dinner for Charles Dickens that was being put on by the Press Club of New York. It was a men's club. And when she was banned from buying a ticket because she was a woman, she was inspired to create the first independent women's club in the US, known as Sorosis, Sorosis, which is a class of plants that bloom into fruits on one body, like a pineapple. May need that on Jeopardy someday. The next year, the club scheduled a meeting at the same place as the Dickens meeting that happened at the same time the men's club was meeting. And of course, at first the restaurant has issue, and because it's going to be a room full of unescorted women. Oh my gosh. So they have issue with it, but then they allow it because it gives the restaurant a progressive reputation, and they realize, oh, that's good for money and good for business. So they hosted the club every year after that. At the first meeting, Jane Crawley states that the purpose was to supply the want of unity and secular organization among women. Companionship with women, quote, whose deeper natures had been roused to activity, who had been seized by the divine spirit of inquiry and inspiration, of thought and progress of the age in what other women were thinking and doing. So some good stuff. The first president was a poet, Alice Cary, and in the history of the founding, again, written by Jane Crawley, in the history, it points out that they didn't have a focus other than acknowledging, I love this quote, the intense desire that women should come together all together, not from one church or one walk of life, but from all quarters and take counsel together. So that's, again, it's really at the heart of all of this was women realizing we can get together, not at home and not at church. We can get together and there's power in them. There's a similar club in Boston that emerges around the same time in the 1860s, and it's called the New England Women's Club. And there began a movement that Alice Cary, the poet, said, "We have tipped the teapot. And the one in Boston is the one that introduces the idea of a structure, of a governing board, regular meetings, intellectual pursuits, all that comes out of that club in Boston. And at first it tended to be very exclusive. It was in general, it was white Protestant women of upper class to middle upper class, with husbands in positions of local prominence and servants who could take care of things back home. Gradually, though, the club idea grows among other groups, including religious, racial, and ethnic minorities. Wage-earning women start to join clubs. They make their own clubs. Of course, as always, working and single mothers find challenge in finding time away from their children. And there is a club in the late 1800s that's a huge news story. It's in New York City. There's a club that does something radical, which is they offer childcare. And this makes a big news story, this idea of offering care for the kids while the moms are getting together for intellectual pursuits. So now to St. Louis. So that's the general movement. And I'm checking the queue. There's no cues for me to A, but there's now to St. Louis. So St. Louis post-Civil War is a boom town. By the end of the 19th century, we're the 5th largest city in the United States. We had universities, cultural institutions, architecture, social complexities that are the same as those cities, the great cities on the East Coast, which of course is reflected in the 1904 World's Fair and all of that. The women's club landscape in St. Louis, at first because of the prosperity felt by the upper middle class, was on par with the movements in the other cities. And that's something that leads to St. Louis being a major player in the movement towards women's suffrage in the 20th century. So those things are connected. And I'm going to look at a few of the St. Louis clubs now. All but one of the clubs that I'm going to discuss are still in existence today. And that was something intentional on my part in moving through the different kind of the example clubs that I pulled out. The first one is usually, when I start talking about women's clubs, a lot of people know this one. And this is an image of a building in the Central West End. And this was the original home of the Wednesday Club. And the Wednesday Club is still very active. They are not in this building in the Central West End. And if you were to go on our walking tour of the Central West End, especially our women's history tour, we do visit this building and talk more about it and go into deeper focus of it. So the Wednesday Club was originally formed as a literary club known as the Shelley Club, Shelley. They changed their name because they started to be kind of questioning the fact that Shelley, the author, had agnostic views, and they didn't want to bring religion into this, a lack of religion. So again, this is their original home in the Central West End. It's now known as the Link Auditorium. It's a nonprofit owns it, and they're renovating the space, an event space. It's on the corner of Westminster and Taylor. So it had a very nice address when it was built, right next to Westminster Place. It was designed by one of the premier St. Louis architects, Theodore Link, which is the same architect as Union Station, even though this building looks very modern. And they were not the first club. They are considered one of the most influential. In 1898, they were the second largest club in the state, and they were the first to organize on what was known as the department plan. So they had committees that were dedicated to literature, history, education, social economics, current topics, art, and science. So they break it all up into those different things, and those groups of women were responsible for cultivating programming based on those topics and any outside activities. In addition to major social reform contributions, which they made some really big contributions, especially for the clean air, playgrounds for children, and many of their members went on to be part of the suffrage movement. So in addition to major social reform, their arts committees also organized something called the Art League, and that put fine art, paintings, and sculptures on school walls throughout the city. So it's something they're doing out in the communities. They staged plays, they had big debates, artistic competitions. They also held national level conventions, and the founders and early members were really influential women of different types, including accomplished writers and progressive reformers. It always does get brought up that T.S. Eliot's mother was a founding member, and Tennessee Williams won the Wednesday Club's Literary Prize in 1936. Of course, he was a local kid at the time and lived in the neighborhood. So I want to highlight, so that's the story, the general story of the Wednesday Club. And like I said, they're still very active. And I recently was asked to give a talk to them on such a great topic. I got to give a talk about the history of graffiti, and not just the history of graffiti in St. Louis, but also like as an artistic movement, and who are the players here in St. Louis? What's the structure? It was so much fun. So there's still an active club. They are looking for really great topics, and they're not afraid to do some more controversial ones. But I want to highlight just a random member that I found in looking through. There's a really great book called Notable St. Louis Women. And Notable St. Louis Women was put out in the early 20th century by a woman, Mrs. Charles Jones. But, and I could have her last name wrong, so ignore that. But anyway, so Notable St. Louis Women was written by a woman who wanted to publish a book highlighting her friends and all the things that they were doing, which were amazing. So this is the one that I wanted to highlight that I found in that book. And this is Mrs. Everett Pattison. And this is her description of this is the description of Mrs. Everett Pattison. While enjoying her many local clubs, such as the Wednesday Club, the Women's Club, the Town Club, the Players, the Alliance Francaise, of which she is vice president, Mrs. Pattison is by no means neglecting her home nor her friends. In the same apartment for 20 years, she has here gathered a circle of intimates, where plutocrat and parnation, social workers, and beautiful debutantes meet on equal footing. And here is seen evidence of the talent for interior decoration, which Mrs. Pattison exercises so often for her friends, and in consultation with professional decorators. Quote, "Life is so intensely interesting," she says, "and perhaps this is the keynote to the character of this transplanted and transformed Puritan. Mrs. Pattison is always handsomely gowned and is a stately woman." So again, I just love this description of, as I mentioned earlier, this being a club woman is part of an identity of the woman. And of course, it points out that she does not neglect Charles. Thank you. Someone pointed out to me it's Charles Johnson. I was close with Jones. Yeah, Mrs. Charles Johnson wrote The Notable Women of St. Louis. Thank you, Anne. So the clubhouse for the Wednesday Club is in Ladue now here in St. Louis. They still offer monthly topics and a wide variety. Each January, the club members vote on which topics they want to hear about throughout the year. And we'll move on now to the next thing. All right. So the next topic, I'm going to go talk about Black women in St. Louis and in the club movement and how that was part of that community. So in St. Louis, the women that were part of the club movement mainly centered in the historic Ville neighborhood in North St. Louis. And these women formed several large and small clubs that mirrored the larger movement's themes. There were some clubs focusing on social reform and some focusing on intellectual pursuits and some that did both. I've got one of them pictured here. This is the St. Louis Book Lovers Club, and this is pictured in the mid-20th century. It was first created to promote intellectual development and to serve as a forum for discussions on social and political issues. Founded in 1907 by a woman named Carrie Bowles, and it was modeled after a similar club she had learned about in Kansas City. The club records show a really committed focus to very serious reading and discussion about politics, art, current events, including issues that affected African American women. They capped membership at 25, and that has been capped since the 1930s. And it's still an active club. It's an elite and selective club. Every 4 years, they collaborate with Washington University to bring in a nationally recognized author to speak. This club has been active for over 114 years. There's another prominent African American women's club group here in St. Louis known as the Informal Dames. And Informal Dames focused on contemporary literature, and there's a lot of interesting stuff written about them. And St. Louis was originally the home to the National Association of Colored Women, which was a national organization sponsoring African American women's clubs, still going strong today. So a lot of good stuff there. We'll move on to our next topic. Third group that formed during the women's club movement and has major historical significance is the Pioneers Club. And this is the nation's first Jewish women's book club. It was founded by a rabbi's wife, and that is this lady here in the middle, and her name is Rosa Sonashan, and she was a mother, a journalist, and is the founder of the first English language Jewish women's magazine called The American Jewess, and that's her there on the left. The Pioneers were initially only a literary club, but eventually they moved into musical performances, readings, and debates about philosophical questions and current issues. Within a few years of their founding, they began the tradition of focusing on one topic per year. In 2020, the theme was American identity. Membership now is still women only, but it has opened up to non-Jewish members. I do have an additional slide on this topic. In researching this paper, in researching this topic, I spent a lot of time reading handwritten meeting notes of different groups, which really feels like time traveling, because a lot of the meeting notes, it's like the very first meeting, and they're laying out who's there and what they're going to be interested in, and it really captures this intimate moment for these groups. But this little note I found in the Pioneers, some of their early records, is one of my favorites. It's a beautiful handwriting, beautiful little note, and I loved that the debate, they had a piano solo, a recitation, a vocal solo, they had a debate, and it was resolved that novel reading is more beneficial than injurious. So I love that. As a big reader myself, I love that they had a debate and it was decided in the affirmative that novel reading was beneficial, was a good thing to do. Checking the Q&A. All right. The last club, and this topic moves so quickly when there's so much more we could talk about. The last club is one of the most interesting to me, and that's the Potters. And this is a club that mimicked the women's club movement, but instead of the format followed by the previously mentioned groups and their counterparts, the Potters was an art collective that created a handmade multimedia magazine. And the reason I bring them into this topic is that they are the early realization of the next level of club culture. So their focus is intellectual pursuits anchored in close female companionship, same as before. They only existed from 1904 to 1907. Their magazine was issued once a month as a single copy. Each issue entirely handmade, had poetry, stories, designs, drawings, essays, plays. They had their meetings every week. And it's important that not only did they produce work, but they made a big deal of critiquing each other's work. And they created a space for women to be honest and to help other women with their creative work and to give honest critique and honest and productive critique. And again, the reason I include them is that, the earlier women's club movements were a way for women that, in say mid-19th century on, those are women that could, they were post-Civil War, women can start to pursue intellectual pursuits in much greater numbers, but they were older women that had not had the chance to go to college when they were younger. These are women that can go to college. These are very young. The Potters are a young group of women, some of them at WashU, some of them just in local private schools. They're in their late teens. So they're kind of that next wave of women that they have access to education on a higher level, and this is how they're using that model to organize. The Potters were led by a teacher named Lily Rose Ernst, and she was an incredibly accomplished Washington University graduate. They followed her almost religiously. If you read into their descriptions of Lily and how they thought of her, they call her goddess many times. So as we move, sticking with them, the Potters included several really famous members as well, including the Pulitzer Prize winning playwright Zoe Akins. That's her on the left. Zoe Akins wrote lots of movies and plays that you would have heard of. The Pulitzer Prize winning poet Sarah Teasdale and the sculptor Carolyn Risquet there on the right. She was from WashU and then later was the head of the arts department at John Burroughs School and one of the founding members. So women that went on to do, pretty big things. So that was a really quick and I feel very whirlwind introduction to the topic and skimming the surface of experiences here in St. Louis. And hopefully the takeaway was how, that movement post-Civil War of women gathering outside of the home, what they could accomplish once they gathered and how different groups experienced it is what I'm hoping is the takeaway. And here's the last slide with, stuff that's coming up, and if you want to become a member. And most importantly, when we are done with our Q&A and done talking, there will be a survey that pops up. And if you can hang around for just a minute and fill out that survey, that is so useful to me as a presenter and as a representative of the Historical Society as I create new talks in the future. I would love any of your questions now or comments. How do garden clubs fit into this? They would fit right in. And that's a great question. And that is one that doesn't come up. The intellectual, literary, stuff like that comes up a lot in the research. So yeah, I don't know exactly when garden clubs start, but I can definitely see it maybe following in that more social club side. That's a really good question. And I don't mind saying I don't know. And so I'm happy to take these questions with me and find answers, and I can get back to you about anything I don't know the answer to. And for anyone that wants to ask me questions maybe offline, I can give my email address, which is aclark, ACLARK, @mohistory.org. We will get some more questions here.
Well, I think you've done an amazing job. It's a very thorough and interesting presentation, so please don't be insulted if we don't have any questions. I think you've done a really wonderful job.
All right.
Yeah, I think this is great. Thank you for, oh, look, there we go.
Yeah,
another question.
How did men react to women's clubs? There's a lot of very enlightening newspaper articles about, what's going on behind these doors and how, just like the story of the men at Charles Dickens club and how they react, that Charles Dickens play talk in New York City at the Delmonico restaurant. They were not pleased that women were starting to organize. I mean, it was preposterous, this idea that they would organize like this. Of course, there are some men though that invite women into their clubs, and there's both sides, but definitely it was something that
I think that sounds like another topic.
Mm-hmm.
The men's clubs are just, how does that fit into the whole movement? Because there were certainly a lot of men's clubs too.
A lot of men's clubs, and they had been around for so much longer. So it's kind of like women asserting them. But the interesting thing with the men's clubs is they're social, and there's business clubs, whereas now we do have business-based women's clubs, but it's definitely a later development. Whereas the men's club, it was kind of always about that.
The last call for questions. I really appreciate everybody's attention, and thank you for tuning in today. As Amanda states, we have a lot of things coming up, as you can see on the slide, and please, when this ends, fill out our survey. Your information is very, very important to all of us. So thank you, Amanda. Great program as usual. And thank you all for tuning in. We will sign off.